We're really happy to see all of you and so interested in this topic. I do want to say a few things about the resource list that we created here. So the resource list is a list that contains all the links that will be referenced today by our speakers, including the wonderful site, the Indian Ocean and World History, the Smithsonian exhibits, and the GEMS app, and so much more. So please take a moment to check it out. At the top of the page, if you look at the very top of the page, we started out with some core ideas about Swahili coast history, including some important debates which we feel you should know about. So for example, one important idea is that the way the narrative has been told about the Swahili coast is that it gets its cosmopolitan and its unique features because of its links with external cultures. This story has been overemphasized, fully overemphasized, at the expense of the role of inland African societies. So thankfully, new scholarship understands the Swahili as home to African populations and has amply demonstrated that inland and the coastal sites, so both the inland and the coastal sites, were part of the same society. Another important point to think about, for all of us to think about, is trade the only story to tell about the region, which I think tends to be the emphasis in schools. Our first speaker, Dr. Kusimba, has been very instrumental in challenging this kind of ingrained knowledge through his extensive and respected scholarship. We are so very honored to have the distinguished Dr. Kusimba kick off the morning for us. Dr. Kusimba is a professor of anthropology at the Institute for Advanced Studies, Culture, and the Environment, and also in the Department of Anthropology at the University of South Florida. His research focuses on the development of pre-colonial complex societies in Eastern and Southern Africa. He's the recipient of numerous grants from the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Fulbright Fellowships, and others. And he's also the author of several books, including The Rise and Fall of Swahili States, which is one of the books linked in the resource list. His research is very far-reaching. And since 2012, he has grounded his intensive archaeological re-excavations of Manda and Gede's medieval cities on the Kenyan coast. And last but not least, he was elected Fellow of the Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2018. So Dr. Kusimba's presentation is titled Innovation, Trade and Leadership, State Founding in East Africa. Welcome, Professor Kusimba. And without further ado, I'll let you share your screen.
Thank you very much, Elsa. Can you all hear me? Can you see the screen clearly?
Yes.
Okay, oh, great, yeah. So Elsa asked me to sort of make a comment on what makes Africa tick today. So when you look at Africa today, how did it become what it became? And I think the one has to interrogate the role of slavery and colonialism. So one of the things that we often get very surprised is that for nearly 400 years, Africans lost the ability to plan and think about tomorrow. And so if you think that for nearly 400 years, Africans did not build a permanent structure, but in fact, during that time, nearly 500 fortresses were built that surrounded basically Africa. And the purpose of that was to extract people and resources out of Africa. And Africa still relieves these images. And I think that in our time, people of African descent are recipients of, in fact, this unequal relationship that has existed over the last 500 years. And so any historian or anthropologist, archaeologist trying to write Africa's past has to peel through this period of 500 years, when in fact it is assumed that Africans lost their agency to recreate their own lives. And I think that slavery had a huge impact on on this. Let me just try to move the slide. And so the archaeological landscapes that we work in, these are landscapes that predate 1500 AD, but these are landscapes that saw during the slaving mechanism when Africans basically left their cities, their towns, and moved into other, essentially they devolved. So you have a situation whereby rural and urban abandonment occurs en masse. You have a situation where herders, farmers, and traders basically devolve to become hunters. When in the 19th century, when European explorers are going into Africa, they encounter these people and they have to marvel, how could people like this be responsible for the monuments that we see around? And in fact, the rewriting of African history began during that time. And so that's essentially what we see. So along the coast, we see nearly 250 towns abandoned. In the hinterland, we see homes, single family homesteads abandoned, and people moving into areas where they could essentially defend themselves. Most of Africa's inland mountains and hilly areas have monuments such as these ones. We characterize them sometimes as homes of hunter-gatherers. But how could hunter-gatherers basically build their homes into these kinds of monuments? This is essentially what we see is a period of the destruction of Africa's basically a civilization. But ways in which we have essentially looked at this, when you look at these legacies of scholarship, the ways of knowing and seeing early civilizations have gone through various historical stages. We have theories of migration and diffusionism that we don't really need to talk about because most of you know about them. The idea that an invention only occurred once and then it moved on to other places. You also have during the colonial period, you have periods when we start talking about regional interaction, that cities could no longer exist on their own without interacting with the rural areas. And of course, during the post-colonial period, everybody wanted to have an history. So we moved again to sort of looking at indigenous developments. And today, I think current scholarship tries to integrate many of these ideas, but we still have a long way to go. And so one of the things that I'm going to try and talk about today is actually how we know what we know in our time. And I think in my own work here, I'm going to focus because I know in the afternoon you are going to be focusing mostly on the Swahili coast itself and the Indian Ocean. I wanted to sort of bring us to thinking about the greater Africa and what was going on there without directly talking about what was only going up, was what was coming in outside from outside into Africa, so we can get a sort of a more balanced representation. Today, the chronology of African archaeology has completely been revised. So rather than situating the Swahili to the 9th century when the people of Africa convert and some adopt Islam, we are pushing the clock to the Bronze Age period when we begin to see connections that in fact many are now calling early evidence of globalization. And we see this lightly through the movement of foods and domesticates that are moving out of Africa and also coming into Africa. And we know that it is that Swahili coast that was the corridor, the gateway through which innovations from Asia and Europe are coming into Africa and innovations out of Africa are leaving. And so this is essentially what we have. We've pushed the clock down to at least 5,000 years. And so when you think about some of the major Bronze Age translocations that are going on, also examined through the movement of foods across Asia and Africa, essentially what we are seeing is that Africans are domesticating not just their landscapes, but they're domesticating foods. These foods eventually move into the Afrasian world. And at the same time, they are recipients of inventions and domestications that are happening in other places. Africa was never isolated from any of these places. And I think that while we are talking about this, it's sometimes good to remind ourselves that in fact to be human is to be African. Because for the last first 5 million years of our existence, Africa was the only home we knew. And so, in many ways, I think when you look at many innovations, it's all through technology. They begin in Africa and move the other way. But somehow, these people lost them. So, the next slide basically talks about some of the other innovations as you move into Southeast Asia. For example, the banana, which became a major food crop in Africa, and some of the phytoliths that have been identified at Musa in the site of Musa in the Great Lakes region, basically was comes from Kogi in India, but was obviously the bananas were first domesticated in New Guinea, and so that movement still continues, and it's fairly old indeed. But I think that as we're talking about this, sometimes it's really good to know what we're talking about. So, what is technology? According to Basala, this is an old definition, but I still like it, is a set of operationally replicable social behaviors that result from the integration of raw materials, knowledge, organization, and consumption. So he's really talking about the embeddedness of technology. It is a material and a digital manifestation of the diverse way humankind defines and pursues uh, existence. An invention is the initial appearance of an idea or a process, whether truly novel or a distinct modification of an existing idea or process. And an innovation is an invention that becomes widely adopted, right? So when you're thinking about some of the changes that are occurring in history, sometimes we are tempted to think in more racialized terms. We have, for example, assumed that Africans were not as innovative. Some thinkers in the past thought of Africa as this deep, dark pocket for where nothing good ever came from. And I think that this is an idea that sometimes in our subconscious still lives in the writings, even of today. Um, but so the idea here is that a successful technological innovation occurs only when all the elements of the system, the social as well as the technological, have been modified so that they work together effectively. It's still Brian Pfaffenberger and Tom Hughes' idea of embeddedness of basically technology, right? So when you're thinking about indigenous forms of knowledge, you can say, assume that it's the creative ability of a people, of a group of people to transform their environment using resources within. And I'm putting out these things because when indigenous technology and knowledge is deeply embedded in people's culture, it serves as a hallmark for identity and a means of survival, right? So when you're thinking about the way people, daily life and the way people make a living, one can look at the people's ability to bring food to the table through their own means. We've seen Africa move from feast to famine over the years, and there's no end that this is ever going to stop in our lifetime. The question is, what really happened that made Africa lose that ability to essentially transform and make decisions that are good for itself? Uh, Shadrach Chirikure basically demonstrates this technological embeddedness by essentially looking at, for example, the technology of iron working within Africa, which was completely embedded, where all of the materials were produced locally, ideas were basically independently developed in a lot of ways. And this is important when you think about Africa itself and look at the non-industrial sites. We sometimes call them metallurgicals, but these are essentially industrial sites. They're all over the continent. right? These are all completely pre-colonial, start from the early Iron Age to the late Iron Age. You move to Northern Africa, you have evidence of Bronze Age, but there are many historians of technology who have spent years denying that in fact these technologies, these technological innovations ever did in fact occur. Even in my own region on the Kenyan coast, even when we have been able to find the earliest examples of crucible steel production, there have been historians of technology there who have denied that these technologies did in fact exist. So when you think about innovation, you look at iron working, the technology, for example, the furnace technology is very, very complex across the board. Africans, in this case, one can argue, were essentially in charge of their destiny. They produced what they wanted, and they were on a trajectory to, in fact, in many ways, I think a lot of these developments were at par with what was going on everywhere. And in fact, all commentators basically argue that smelters in several parts of Africa developed primarily processes that could smelt iron, titanium, all this, which cannot be used in modern blast furnaces today, but it's all right. So let's look at the state. According to the late Bruce Trigger, the state is a politically organized society that is regarded by those who live in it as sovereign or politically independent and has leaders who control its social, political, legal, economic, and cultural activities. So when thinking about the Swahili state, do they actually have this? Can we archaeologically demonstrate that this in fact did exist? Do they qualify to be states? Generally, states tend to have recognizable features such as urbanism, specialized production, and long distance interactions. And I think that the last part is really trade. A state cannot really exist on its own. It has, by its very nature, to incorporate other communities. Its basis is based on diversity and cooperation with others, right? And often these states have centralized political authority in the hands of very few uh, small elite. This is actually true then as it is now. So when you look at the east coast of Africa, you'll be able to see that along its entire coast, there are many, just hold on and pick this. See that? Sorry about that. That was my wife's call. She left the phone here and I was talking to her. So when you look at the Swahili coast, we have identified nearly 400 towns and cities along its length from Somalia all the way to Mozambique, all the way to Mozambique. In inland Southeast Africa, you see many similar sites that are contemporary to that, and a lot of work has been done in Southeast Africa. There is a lot going on in Somalia, but because of political problems over the last few years, we know precious little about what is going on in Somalia. So during the times of the periplus, there are fewer towns that had emerged, but then these continue, and by 1500, you have this, and anybody traveling along the African coast will encounter town after town after town. These towns were diverse. They were inhabited by people from the wider Indian Ocean, but they were also inhabited by people from rural Africa and people from merchants from both places, right? In Kenya, if you look at these are some of the sites that I've worked, and I'm going to be talking about that. In Tanzania, we haven't done as good a job moving into inland Africa. And so a lot of the writings, the publications out of Tanzania generally tend to focus on the islands and the coast, but I think they have not moved further inland. I think in Southern Africa, I think that the story is much more complete because a lot of work has been done in Great Zimbabwe to sort of bridge the gap. So what are some of the crucial factors that we talk about when you're thinking about the state, Swahili coast? Trade is a major one, and we'll be talking about some of this now and then in the afternoon. We also have investment in extractive technologies, for example, iron working, as have hinted, and then you have elite monopolization of wealth creating resources. The rich somehow always find their way to exploit everyone else, right? The Swahili coast and other states were not very different. So, what are some of the evidence we have? The evidence we have are clear-cut changes in household side and settlement hierarchies through time, right? We also have clear evidence of differences in wealth and status among the peoples who are living in these emergent polities, right? And so some of the fine examples, these are examples that I draw from my work on the course. So if you look at some of these towns, we have essentially uh, divide, classify them into 5 classes, beginning from the smallest to the largest towns. And so you will have, because this is being posted, you'll have a lot of time to see this. But I think that this table essentially shows the trajectory of the complexity of, in fact, this started. The majority of these towns were very small hamlets, sometimes villages, and some of the towns that essentially had that were located in deeper harbors were able to develop into, and were much more strategically placed, were able to develop into large city states. For example, Mogadishu, Barawa, Malindi, Lamu, Mombasa, Pate, Ungwana, Gede in Kenya, of course, Kilwa, Sofala, and then in later years, Zanzibar. These are some of the towns that essentially we are talking about. So, but in thinking about, we'll talk about it, but I want to sort of go back and lay the basis of what made Africa an attractive place. Nobody's going to travel and risk their life across these high seas and come to Africa if they have nothing to offer. This is something that we have completely forgotten. So when you look at African story, particularly inland story, that is so persuasive, we see very early on in the early part of the first millennium, developments coming in cow pastoralism. People begin investing in cattle keeping. And we know that the result is that you have, of course, cow pastoralism immediately accompanied by a reduction in infant mortality. Children suddenly are drinking milk, they're living better, and they're dying less, right? And of course, when children survive, we see a stimulation of population growth, right? Farming stimulated demographic growth such that by the 5th century, much of Eastern and Southern Africa is essentially inhabited by sedentary societies. So those of us who have worked in inland Africa see these changes that are happening when in fact along the coast there's almost nothing. We have very few sites. Around 5th century AD, we have few recognizable sites on this. But in inland, you have these large villages that are dependent on cow pastoralism and some farming essentially emerging. So farming and pastoralism initiates distinctions about communal and private property, tolerance for inequality, and respect for private property. We see these essentially are coming. So cattle owners, according to Shenjere Nyabeze, she argues that cattle ownership defined wealth and status, and those who possess more of it enjoyed higher status. For example, they could be able to have larger families, marry more women, build greater alliances across different clans, and those are the people who are likely to emerge into leadership positions as time went by, right? So we also have very early on, before the rise of Islam, evidence for interethnic and interregional trade among inland peoples, foragers, herders, and farmers. And whenever we excavate these sites, what we find at hunter-gatherer homesteads, we also find them at herders as well as farmers. For example, the ostrich eggshell bead that you find it every site in Africa that you dig. This is a trading commodity that was consumed by everyone, from a hunter-gatherer to a farmer to anybody, right? And these provide evidence for this interregional trade that is going on. Often they are not taken into consideration. Iron smelting, smithing, and pottery making became more specialized as knowledge increasingly became restricted to specific families and clans, and its practice very highly ritualized. This is going on because it's the idea of protecting one sphere of knowledge, right? You don't just discard it. So you're beginning to see early on the formation of, in fact, classes and people beginning to specialize. So, for example, hydrologists or rainmakers were later to become very, very important in these societies. So investment in animal and crop husbandry increases household wealth. There's consciousness about territorial and ancestral cat spirits that are beginning to emerge. And I think we don't often pay a lot of attention to that. And so when you get to other regions, when you begin to think about not just regional trade, but in fact, uh, international maritime trade interlocking on what was already existing, you begin to see in inland Africa the processing of ivory for long distance uh, transportation. So some of the very early evidence of ivory we find in inland Africa are cut ivories like these ones here. When you cut it like this, you are able to grade it and you can transport it easily to the coast, because one person can just put a whole thing in a bag and walk about. The images we see in the 19th century is this ivory is no longer cut, but you have people hauling it, right? It's evidence of Africans basically losing that ability to, in fact, set prices for their own products, right? But this is a clear evidence of, in fact, price setting that, in fact, we often forget. So that landscape from for in inland Africa has all but disappeared, but what essentially remains is the landscape that we find in Southeast Africa, the Great Zimbabwe, and the many Zimbabwe's that were essentially built. The very early slide that I showed you was the slide of a landscape in Savo, Kenya, which is only 150 kilometers. And you have many rock shelters like that are built with dry stone architecture. But this was date to the 15th century, to the last 400 years. But I think contemporary to the emergence of the Swahili states, you have states in inland Africa, here represented by this great landscape of Zimbabwe. So in many ways, I think you're looking at a bedrock of this economy, which is craft industries, including iron, gold, copper mining, smelting, elephant hunting, ivory carving, stone carving, all were very labor intensive and were carried out on a scale that requires astute leadership and management skills. So when you think about the gold of Sofala, think about what it takes to find it, to mine it, to process it, to organize its transportation to Kilwa from where it is then exported, right? You're not really talking about simple societies. You're talking about very, very highly advanced societies. That process of technological embeddedness, of leadership, right? And so when you do that, then you begin paying attention to some of these landscapes that in time have essentially regrown back and people can easily forget them. The introduction of Asian farming practices in inland Kenya, for example, in the area that is now Tsavo National Park, rice farming becomes a staple in around 800 AD. And this is basically to fuel the demand for for food in all these emergent cities. Some of these will also be exported to other places, right? But this particular slide is of a landscape in Madagascar, in central Madagascar, that I've been working on, where in fact cattle keeping and rice farming essentially go hand in hand, because you do need to fertilize these lands. In the area of Savo, I found landscapes such as these ones very, very clearly. And this was going on. So along the coast, evidence while this is all going on, along the coast, we see the emergence of investments in these permanent inheritable homes, right? And the stability that's even because the economy is very, very strong, and you begin to see the emergence of these build-up spaces, towns. But in fact, when you think about that, you can also think about the power dimensions, the gender equity that seems to go hand in hand with many of this. You're looking at, on my left, you have tombs of elite women. And then here you have a tomb of an elite man. The poor elite men along the coast generally used to have these pillars that James Kirkman called the phallic pillars. Of course, the tombs of elite women generally used to be built like that, but very, very beautifully decorated with porcelain. Right? Swahili is not technically a matriarchal society, but in many ways, I think because the Swahili, traditional Swahili practiced matrilocal residence, women were very, very powerful. And the firstborn child will always inherit the polity. So Swahili society was ruled by both men and women. And some of the women leaders were very, very powerful. The last woman to reign on the Swahili coast died in 1915. When the Omanis came, they basically started excluding them from leadership, and sometimes just pushing them out of leadership. But essentially, these are the sort of the landscapes that we're talking. One of the landscapes that I've called urban landscape I've worked on is Mtwapa, and this one here, we have a very early date of 1700 BCE, when it's inhabited by a small hunting and gathering group, and then later it develops. By the 10th century, it develops into a really nice port town, serving both the mainland and but it was relatively small compared to others like Gede, Kilwa, Unguja Ukuu, Malindi, and many other towns. But nonetheless, the Mtwapa Creek, which you see here, was a deep natural harbor. Today, you can land sort of a major an American carrier. I'm just what is escaping. But this harbor is extremely deep, and it is a natural harbor, and I think it was an attractive place for people to live there. Most of these towns essentially were fortified too. So far, what we have done is we have in this area, we have mapped more than 350 archaeological sites. We have intensively excavated 12, and we've been able to show occupation spanning the early Holocene to essentially the present. So whenever we talk about the Swahili coast and we begin from the rise of Islam, we are not only talking about a small segment of that society, but we have to really go back in and show how it developed areas, the way where it sort of, those kinds of things. And we've been able to demonstrate through our work. One of the questions that we have addressed is, who are these people? And the question of identity was never really addressed. Hypotheses were made about this being Arab states, evidence of most of Asiatic colonization, but nobody had really bothered to look at the genetics, the archaeogenetics of the biological, the skeletal biology of these communities. And what we've been able to do is we excavated at Mtwapa and more recently at Manda, recovered more than 110 individuals. And in a study that we've done, we've been able to show that the residents of these towns are predominantly African, skeletally, although they were Muslims by culture and leanings, by shown by the way they are buried. But within this, there is also evidence of intermarriage. And so we see evidence for example, non-Africans being married side by side with their African relatives, right? So evidence of intermarriage is going on. And David Reich, we are collaborating with David Reich, looking at, for example, the genetics of these communities. And we have been reluctant to sort of um, just uh, publish what we are finding, because I want us to do a very, very intensive study so that when we finally publish this data, we publish everybody rather than pick and choose. But what we are finding is evidence of the Swahili coast essentially representing what was essentially this pan-Indian Ocean communities. We have evidence of families moving from Syria, evidence of family perhaps even from Central Asia, moving and doing business in these places. But predominantly, these societies were inhabited by local people and things like that. But because they are cities, they also had a sort of foreign resident communities, some of whom became very powerful in those communities. And we're talking about pre-15th century, 15th century period, right? And so when you think about the evidence, clearly, when you think about what we have found out in our work, cross specialization exceeds household scales. So the Swahili are developing their own industries and they're selling most of what they are producing to inland peoples. So there's inland communication. And so this table here, and you'll have a lot of time to sort of look at it, essentially looks at the general chronology and what each period has been able to show. And you can see a general trajectory from period A, which is around which is about the beginning of the time of Christ, all the way to the present. And you can see a society that rises and then eventually it begins to decline, right? And you'll have a lot of time to be able to do that. Um, but I think, how much time do we have, Elisa?
We want to leave some time for discussion and questions. So I would say about 5 more minutes and then
Okay, so the rest of the work sort of about the regional trade and its consequences, and I sort of just go through that, and we'll have a lot of time to go through that, and we can also talk. But then I also talk about what is coming, where everything that we recover archaeologically is coming from, right? And so you have products that are coming from inland Africa to the coast. And then you have items that we have also found in inland places that are coming from the coast to Africa. And then you also talk about the primary producers of these African trade items. And so this table essentially establishes the interaction spheres that you're basically talking about, that the evolution of the Swahili state, the evolution of urbanism in East Africa was a product and of many. It was a product of cooperation. It was a product of leadership. It was a product of, in fact, agency, most of which is basically homegrown. Some of the artifacts that we find are like glass that we have been able to analyze, and they come from many different parts of the Asiatic world, including Egypt. We found ceramics that is drawn from basically the entire region of Asia, from Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, of course, China, Southwest Asia, and all of and you can trace through it in terms of time. You can see changes through time, moving one. There are times when one region dominates, and then there are times when another region dominates. And I think you can look at the histories of what is going on in those places to be able to understand or how merchants in those places are in fact doing. We also found evidence of outsourcing. So for example, at one point, Persian entrepreneurs essentially move their industry into Gujarat and begin producing the so-called Islamic monochromes from sites such as Kambat, when it became impossible or more expensive to produce in Iran and Iraq. So these things are certainly going on. In terms of beads, we've been able to demonstrate that Africans are not only consuming, in fact, glass beads, but if you look here, they are also making their own beads, right? And in terms of just quantity, for each three glass beads that we get along the Swahili coast, we recover 100 ostrich and marine eggshell beads. These other slides basically show some of these are called bead grinders. So it provides evidence that these guys were actually making their own beads and selling and not just consuming. And so in terms of investment, I think you'll go through that. This one basically talks about the basis, the agrarian and the economies and the sites that we've been, the industries that we're developing alongside as these towns are emerging. And so this essentially sort of about the local industries. And then this basically also talks about the importance of in fact, aesthetics, how do I look effect that characterized elite women's way of life in many of these places, right? Regional, we will go through that. And I think the landscape that we're talking about, that we often seem to forget. When you think about the regional economy, as towns emerge, they're built of different materials, but inland you also have these communities. You have farmers, you have herders, you have specialized hunters, those people who killed elephants and brought them. They were all working together, and one has to be able to integrate that history in order to be able to really provide justice to the region's history. And here is a way in which we try to explain this sort of mosaic. And I think that the study here is an emerging landscape that we see here today is even as the coast begins to urbanize, you also have inland communities that are also really, really engaged in this production. Things are moving back and forth. Their interaction spheres that are based on cooperation, they're based on ritual relationship like blood brotherhoods and all of that, but they make for the, and it's really important that we integrate these kinds of evidence, because without doing so, we'll continue to recreate this model that basically says that, oh yeah, the Africans have always been people who didn't have agency, but have always, whenever you find something good in Africa, is really someone else's work. That I want to stop there and hope and I hope that we can have some conversation. I'm really sorry that we started late, and but you have a longer PowerPoint that you can integrate into your own studies. I'll now shut up and listen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kusimba. This is really such a rich and informative context, and delving deeper into your archaeological research is phenomenal. So one of the first questions that came up is, are there any resources to show the interregional trade prior to the Islamic traders?
Resources. Yeah, there are lots. One of the, because a lot of this work was done in the 19, we began moving into the interior in 2000. And so we have collected an enormous amount of data. And so we're just beginning to publish some of this work. It's going to essentially become available. I just finished writing a book for Cambridge Elements, and which I'm going to send it to a copy editor. And this book is essentially designed to address K1 through 12 classes. I'm hoping that we'll have a lot of images to go with it. But essentially, this book looks at the deep history of the Swahili medieval states and how not to study them. And I think it's going to be a major resource. Some of our colleagues, Jeffrey Fleischer, Stephen Wynne Jones, have really done some spectacular work in integrating the Zamani. I think those links were there. And so they have done sort of mapping of this, of some of the towns at Sonkomnara where they have worked. We did some work at Gede. And so a lot of these resources are essentially becoming available. I've done a documentary that never really took off. I worked on it with a colleague who moved to Colombia. And I think I have a copy of that and we can get some of that available. It's a little bit dated, but I think it's still available and I think teachers will be able to take advantage of it. One of the problems that we have in terms of just getting this story out is precisely because there's so much that has been written. Neville Chittick and James Kirkman were larger than life archaeologists. They were also extremely prolific. And so try as we might, what they wrote about the Swahili civilization is still very readily available. And so it's very hard to unseat some of those perspectives. And I think that often I think there's also the tendency to think that Islam was this civilizing element of the coast. But I think one of the things we forget is that up until now, Islam never became dominant along the coast. And there are all these people in inland Africa from Somalia all the way to Mozambique that speak Swahili or a related language, but they are not Muslims, right? And so the focus that Islam basically became really dominant is actually untrue. That in fact, the vast majority of the coast is inhabited by people who are still very much follow traditional ways of life, traditional religions. And Islam was predominantly an urban uh, a practice, but in inland, more rural Africa, I think it's an integration of both Islamic and African ways of worshiping.
Thank you, Dr. Kusimba. I just want to mention that your video is off. In case you would like to turn it back on again at the bottom of your window, it would be wonderful to see you again.
Oh yeah, thanks.
Great. Another question, there's many questions that have come in, so I don't know how much time we'll have to be able to address all of them, but certainly one thing that I will do is I will compile the questions and send them on to you if there are any resources that you may add. So the next question that came in is, can you please clarify what is the significance of the ivory that was cut versus the ivory that is whole and hauled over the shoulder, like we saw during European colonization? So what do historians learn from that? And that came from Gary.
Okay, so I think that's a great question. So, so when we found evidence of cut ivory, this is actually in a house that I excavated in Kasigao in 2001. This is Kasigao is a Taita, an inland Kenya community. It's just about 150 kilometers from the coast. So we found this cut ivory in someone's house, and it represented clear to me. It represented the portability of this product. That in fact, when you cut it, you are able to grade it. And so when you take these pieces to the coast, you can basically say, well, this one, this is how thick it is. This one, costs so much money, this costs so much money, this costs so much money. But in terms of just transportation costs, it's actually easier to transport. But when you, so that evidence is there and it stands out. But then it is contrasted by later images of whole ivory essentially being transported from inland, usually by one or two people. So it's a very inefficient means of transportation. But at the same time, an argument was always made that Africans in East Africa did not really effectively use ivory, so they only exported it. Of course, this is contradicted by what we see in West Africa, in the way that the craft of carving ivory was so advanced. And when you look at Makonde in Tanzania, they do these very elaborate carvings that there's no reason why they could not have extended it to ivory. So the question here is just about price setting. It's evidence for controlling your own product and doing it your own way rather than having someone else essentially set prices. And I think it also means that the people who are carving and cutting it will lose their jobs once you begin exporting them whole. For me, it symbolizes the loss of control over one's own economy. And of course, you can extend that to ironworking industries that basically dry out. You can extend that to farming practices that become completely destroyed. You can do that on anything.
Thank you. A quick question and a longer one. So one quick question around clarifying the name of the site of the deep water port, the coastal dig where the water was deep in the harbor.
Yes.
The longer question is, what archaeological evidence in Asian and Arabian coastal regions of African goods beyond ivory and gold? Angela is interested in the ceramics trail and the beads in particular.
Yeah. Okay. So this site is called Mtwapa, Mtwapa, Mtwapa. And if you look at my book, I talk about it. I have a short note in La Violette and Win John's volume, where I have 4 essays where with colleagues we sort of sum up some of the specific sites that we have worked at. But in Win John's and La Violette volume, look up our chapter on mosaics and interaction, because that chapter essentially speaks to what I was really talking about. But it also shows, I have tables there that show the percentage of products that are coming from what regions and coming to the coast and into the coast and all of that. So that will be very good. In terms of just what is coming out of Asia, beads represent a very interesting phenomenon, because one interesting thing about beads is their portability, the survivability, and the fact that they were also cheap. They are produced for the masses, so that the poorest person in Africa will still have access to the beads. The richest person will have the richest one can buy the carnelian, right? The poorest person can buy the alumina, silica beads, right? And so across Africa, you see all these glass beads from rock shelters all the way to the graves of the super rich and famous, right? And so beads represent that, and you can trace the movement of beads mostly to South Asia in the early period. These beads are actually coming from sites in at the tip of of India and Sri Lanka, sites like Giribawa. So by the 5th century, we begin to see a shift, so that a lot of the beads that are being made are coming from some of the central sites in Maharashtra, like Chaul, and you move up to Gujarat, right? And then in the later period, you see a major shift where many of the beads from the 15th century begin to come from Europe, from Venice. So the very same beads that we see in Native American sites during the time of the colonial period here are the beads that we see in Africa. And so beads essentially represent really great evidence for globalization in a lot of ways because they were mass produced and could be consumed by anyone. Ceramics provide a different dimension altogether. They are portable, but because they are also bulky, they can only be moved to particular places. And so you tend to see the concentration of ceramics into only along the coast. And in inland Africa, we see these ceramics in places that are closer to the coast where moving them up and down could have been very easy. So for example, Jonathan Walls has found large amounts of ceramics, both Islamic and Chinese, along the Pangani Valley, the Rufiji River valleys, and to assume they are moving them up and down using canoes and boats in rivers that are navigable. And then we also see a lot of ceramics, foreign ceramics in larger cities like Great Zimbabwe and even Apungubwe, because there you have a wealthy enough elite that it could actually afford to buy this product, because by the time they get there, they are also expensive. So in fact, I use foreign ceramics to show differences, social inequalities within African societies. I use beads to demonstrate the interaction spheres and the reach of trade networks within Africa itself. But ceramics does not often tell you that, right? And so that's the thing. And you can one way in which we've been able to use ceramic, at least in my work, is to be able to show regions in Asia where particular pieces, where the kilns are located. So I use Chinese porcelain to be able to show and talk about what is happening in China at this time. Why do we have Longchuan wares and suddenly you begin to see other kiln sites basically begin to dominate as those ones. So I use them to understand the sort of the politics, the economic politics of those places. In the middle, in Southwest Asia, it's essentially the same thing. But I also use foreign ceramics, particularly Islamic ceramics, to talk about competition between the merchants and the entrepreneurs in Asia as they compete for foreign markets, right? There's a lot of evidence of imitation wear. There's a lot of evidence of outsourcing, right? And so these things are, there's so much that we can learn from this, not just to be able to, the problem that is we sort of simplistically saw this as evidence of Muslim settlement on the coast. No, it doesn't show that, because we now know that a lot of the so-called Islamic monochromes were actually made by non-Muslim Indians and consumed by Muslims, right? So it doesn't always follow that way. But there's so much that we can use trade items to sort of figure what is going on in their source areas. Uh, but what we do know is that I need to point out that of all the ceramics that we find, they only represent 5% of the ceramics that we recover on the coast. 95% are actually locally made, right? And so Henry Mutoro did a quantitative analysis of this on his side, and he concluded that for every 10,000 African potsherds, he could only recover 4 foreign ceramics. Now, look at the publications. We don't mention African pottery. If you look at beads and look at the publications, most of the publications talk about glass beads because it's easier to study them. But I just demonstrated here that for every 3 glass beads, I have recovered 97 ostrich or marine beads. So what's wrong with this picture? Right? And especially in our time. Why can't we develop means of actually studying ostrich eggshell beads to show some of, through isotopic analysis, regions where these materials are coming from? Is it that hard? Or is it just a part of the silencing that continues to perpetuate itself? And I think that especially now, when we are talking about Black Lives Matter, when we are seeing the effects of inequality in our own society, when we are seeing we ourselves, we Americans, repeating the same mistakes that South Asians did when the plague occurred. We never learned anything. We never learned that one of the reasons why Europe recovered so quickly from the plague and 200 years later basically overran the world is because they followed science. Most of that science came from the Middle East. But in fact, Southwest Asian elites at the time had become bloated with power. They completely forgot that they had invented this knowledge. And when the plague hit, they made all the serious mistakes that we ourselves are repeating at this point, right? So, yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kusimba. Um, there's many other questions, which unfortunately we won't have time to address, but I promise everybody that I will send the questions to you, and hopefully we can continue the conversation in that way by finding resources that address them. I'll ask one last question. If there is a name for the slave trade that impacted the Swahili coast parallel to Maafa for the transatlantic slave trade. So
Yes.
is there a name?
Parallel to Maafa. So I raised this issue one time at a conference. And so if you look at a lot of historians, economic historians have done some research. I think Paul Lovejoy has written tremendously about this in terms of just the impact, the relative impact. And I think that the numbers generally are more or less similar. 11 million, one transatlantic, 11 million to Asia. And I think that in my own work, there's sort of snippets of kidnappings that seem to be going on even as early as the 9th century, when children are lured onto ships that are about to depart and then they disappear. So there's the evidence of that's evidence of peonage, of kidnapping that is associated with that. But I think that I sort of have taken a different approach to this, that if ships are coming and then when they leave, they are kidnapping children and all of that, and then the following year they return, I think that what will happen is that if the following year they return, people will be waiting for them, right? Why is it that they are able to come back and there are no complaints and these kidnappings continue, right, offered under the rug? My perspective here is that it is quite possible that as these towns are emerging, you also begin to see the emergence of the vice that is often associated with um, urbanism, where is that are these children of single mothers? Is that age-old tradition of sex workers emergent? And what was the nature of relationship of these African women with these men who are sailors who will essentially come in? Are these actually they going back with their children, or are just kidnapping children that are essentially street children? We do not often think about some of the problems that these early cities as they emerged are basically faced. But that could be the way. But in many ways, as we think about this question of the impact of obviously in Asia, it is much older. And in Asia, it was not just confined to Africans. Eastern and Central Europeans were part of that slaving mechanisms. They are being enslaved in Southwest Asia. Of course, Iran and Iraq, these are major uh, civilizations at the time. And so they could seek labor from any part of the world. I think that we haven't fully studied slavery in Southwest Asia, in part because it's much harder to do that. But even we ourselves in East Africa did not have not continued studying this because of the need to sort of build these cohesive post-colonial societies that are united, so that we do not start accusing each other as who done what and who done that. So there's a sense of amnesia that has characterized what we do in East Africa. And I think that it probably needs to, because when we started doing this, we immediately started seeing the increasing discrimination of Muslim East Africans, right? We saw, I've written about the loss of the Swahili heritage when they lost their determination because they were being accused of being descendants of these Arab slavers, right? And so because of that, anybody could come from Nairobi and claim their land. And we've seen this happen. Most Swahilis are landless people, right? They are Africans. They're landless people. But in fact, these are sort of the benefits we get from the improper writing of a people's history. Where so when the pendulum changes, then these descendants who are essentially also survivors become victims. And essentially the victims themselves begin to victimize other victims of history. So I think it's really important to be very careful and sensitive to some of these questions, even as we strive to sort of write the history so that we are very clear that we are not essentially pointing out, we can point out some of the sort of those mistakes never get repeated. But when we say that, oh, your descendants did not have agency, they were not innovative, then we always force a sort of extreme response. So the search for Africa roots, the search for that that engages in its own silencing, right? So when you're sort of push the African agency, does that mean you should silence other agencies, right? No, of course not. We shouldn't even do that. Somehow, I think the problem we have had in East African studies is that it is only in East Africa where Muslims became synonymous with Arabs. We don't say the same thing in West Africa. Why? They're the same people. Why do we think the Swahili are descendants of Arabs when in fact Arabs can't understand Swahili? An Arab person doesn't understand Swahili. An educated Swahili will understand some Arabic. right? And the reason is because the standard Swahili that we adopted was essentially from Zanzibar, which at the time was the seat of Omani power, right? So I think a certain kind of sensitivity as we write about this, as we remember, uh, has to have to, as I say as I say, a science-driven perspective that is based on how we read the evidence, if it's there, that we can bring different voices to how we read that evidence. But we should never, ever participate in the fabrication of history or historical fact or archaeological evidence. I do think that our predecessors were engaged in the fabrication, which is why I'm going back to places like Gede and finding that 97% of all of the pottery is locally made and it's not published. Why?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kusimba. This is so meaningful and very, very important, from the larger scale of history to the in-depth look at the ethical issues related to the way we represent the region. I think I rejoin everybody in the Zoom room at the moment who is expressing gratefulness for what you shared and your presentation. There's lots and lots of accolades and thank you